James sat back in his first-class seat, feeling the familiar excitement of travel. It wasn't just any flight. This one was important. He was heading to a business conference, something that could bring even bigger opportunities. The soft hum of the plane's engines and the warm, luxurious seat were a welcome comfort for the long trip ahead. The air was calm, but there was something in the air that James couldn't quite place. As he glanced around, he noticed some passengers whispering. He couldn't hear the exact words, but their eyes lingered a little too long on him. He shrugged it off, assuming it was just his imagination. The flight attendant, a young woman, came over to him with a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked for his drink order in a tone that seemed professional, but a little too rehearsed. James gave his order politely, noting that she barely made eye contact with him. He wondered if it was just nerves, but something about her behavior felt off. He looked around the cabin again. Most of the other passengers were relaxed, chatting quietly or lost in their own thoughts. But James couldn't shake the feeling that there was a quiet tension in the air. Maybe he was just imagining things. After all, he was a businessman, used to the occasional uncomfortable social moment. But this was different. As he took a sip from his drink when it was brought back to him, he saw the flight attendant talking to another crew member, and he caught the word first class. It was brief, just a quick exchange, but it made James uneasy. He brushed it off. Surely he was being paranoid. Maybe they were just talking about the schedule. However, as the flight continued, the little moments started adding up. When James asked for a blanket, the attendant seemed a bit slow to bring it over. She was friendly enough, but there was an undercurrent of something he couldn't put his finger on. Then, when another passenger asked for a drink, she practically rushed to serve them. But when James asked for a second round, she barely glanced at him, as though she had forgotten. His mind began to race. Was he imagining this, or was something wrong? He glanced down at his ticket again. It clearly stated first class in bold letters. Everything about his seat, his service, his position in the plane confirmed that he was in the right place. So why was he being treated differently? James felt the sting of humiliation. It wasn't the kind that made you shout or demand attention, but the kind that made you question yourself and your place in the world. He had earned everything he had, and still, here he was, feeling like he didn't belong in this space. His thoughts were interrupted when a voice suddenly came over the intercom, signaling the next phase of the flight. He was snapped back into the moment, but the unease lingered. The quiet judgment, the cold behavior, it was all building up in his mind, but he refused to let it affect him. He leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath, determined not to let the atmosphere around him ruin the rest of his journey. He had dealt with challenges before, and this would be no different. But little did he know, the story was about to take a twist that no one could have predicted. As the flight continued, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the coldness of the flight attendant or the glances from some of the passengers. There was an underlying discomfort in the air that seemed to follow him wherever he went, like a shadow he couldn't escape. Every time he asked for something, it felt like he was being ignored or given less attention than the others in first class. Even small things, like the way she handed him his drink, seemed different, almost as if she were doing it reluctantly. James had traveled many times before, but this was different. In the past, first-class service had been impeccable. The attendants were always smiling, eager to help, and made sure that everything was perfect. But today, something was amiss. He could feel the subtle tension in the air, like the flight crew was treating him differently, but he didn't know why. A few moments later, the same flight attendant came back to check on him. She was holding a tray with a small snack, but barely made eye contact. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. James nodded, though he couldn't help but wonder if she was doing this just to check off a box. He decided to make small talk, something he had learned over the years to break the ice during flights. "It's a smooth ride, isn't it?" he said with a smile. She looked at him quickly, nodded, and gave him a small, tight-lipped smile before moving on to another passenger. The contrast in the way she treated the other first-class passengers was clear. They seemed to get much more attention, laughter, and care than he did. And that was when it hit him. He wasn't just being ignored. He was being treated differently, deliberately. It wasn't just bad service or a simple mistake. Something was going on. It wasn't lost on him that all of this was happening because of the way he looked. James knew that he was the only person of color in first class, and although it hurt to admit it, he had an unsettling feeling that it was because of that fact that he was being treated with such indifference. His stomach turned as he recalled the whispers he had overheard earlier, the sideways glances exchanged between some of the passengers. He wasn't used to feeling out of place, but right now, it seemed impossible to ignore the obvious discomfort he was causing just by being there. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was this really happening? Was this just his imagination running wild? He sat back in his seat, trying to calm himself. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to draw attention to himself, but he was starting to feel angry at the injustice of it all. He had worked hard for everything he had, and yet, here he was, humiliated by the very people who should be treating him with respect. James glanced around the cabin once again. Everyone else was settled, talking to the flight attendants, enjoying their drinks and snacks. It was hard to ignore the stark contrast between their treatment and his. The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. Why was he being treated like this? What had he done to deserve it? All he wanted was to enjoy his flight, just like everyone else. But little did he know, things were about to take an unexpected turn. A revelation that would leave the entire plane in shock and change the way everyone saw him. The flight attendants would soon learn that they had made a serious mistake in their judgment, and James was going to teach them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. As the flight moved along, James continued to try and ignore the uncomfortable situation around him. He focused on the conference he was traveling to, mentally preparing for the big meetings ahead. But despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the growing frustration in his chest. Each time he asked for something, whether it was a glass of water or a blanket, the service felt colder, more distant, and as the hours passed, the realization sank deeper. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the flight attendants. It was the way the other passengers behaved, too. When James overheard a couple of them chatting, their voices dropped when they spoke about him, their eyes flickering in his direction, not bothering to hide their thoughts. It was almost as if they were talking about him as if he didn't belong. He had experienced racism before, but this was different. This wasn't just a random incident. It was something deliberate, like they were all part of some unspoken agreement. The moment came when James asked the flight attendant for a small adjustment to his seat. It was a minor request, something anyone in first class could ask for. However, the attendant's reaction was more than just surprise. It was almost like she had been inconvenienced by his question. "Sir, are you sure you want that?" she asked, a note of condescension in her voice that made him pause for a moment. James, taken aback, nodded. He didn't understand why she was questioning him. It was his seat, after all. But then came something unexpected. The attendant didn't return for several minutes. What was supposed to be a simple task was dragging on, and he was left sitting there, feeling even more uncomfortable. The other passengers were starting to notice, and James could feel their eyes on him. It was as if they were waiting for him to make a mistake, to act out. They probably thought he didn't belong in first class. When the attendant finally came back, she was carrying the blanket James had requested. But there was something strange in her eyes, something cold, almost as if she was punishing him for asking. She handed him the blanket in a way that almost seemed like an afterthought, as if it didn't matter to her. James took the blanket with a forced smile, trying his best to remain composed. But inside, his anger was growing. It wasn't long after that another flight attendant arrived. This one was different, more professional and warm, not like the first. She quickly noticed the tension and greeted James with an unexpected friendliness that almost made him feel better. But it wasn't enough to erase what had happened before. Then, a strange thing happened. The first flight attendant, the one who had been so dismissive, suddenly became flustered. She looked at James, then back at the other flight attendant, and seemed to whisper something under her breath. Whatever she said made the second attendant stop and stare at James in shock, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. James didn't understand what was going on. Why were they reacting like this? He was just another passenger, another business traveler trying to make his way to a conference. He had seen plenty of first-class flights in his time, and this was not how things usually went. But now, as he sat there, confused and irritated, he had no idea how much the situation was about to change. The second flight attendant quickly turned to the first, saying something that made her face go pale. James could sense something shifting, but he had no idea what it was. Whatever the conversation was, it would soon lead to a revelation that would leave everyone on the plane stunned, and it would completely change the way they viewed him. The tension in the air was palpable as the flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, their whispered conversation only adding to the growing confusion in James's mind. He sat back in his seat, his curiosity now piqued, wondering what was going on. His stomach churned with a mix of frustration and anticipation, unsure whether to confront the situation or let it pass. The flight seemed to drag on longer than it should have, the seconds ticking by slowly as the atmosphere became heavier with each passing minute. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the second flight attendant, who had seemed more professional and polite, approached James again. This time, her demeanor was completely different. She was visibly anxious, almost apologetic. She took a deep breath before addressing him. "Mr. Williams," she began, using his name this time, which caught him off guard. I need to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. There's been a mistake, and I just want to clear it up." James blinked, not sure what she meant by mistake. He hadn't been expecting an apology at all, certainly not from someone who had treated him with such indifference earlier in the flight. His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them seemed to make sense. "I don't quite understand," James replied, his voice calm but firm. "What exactly are you apologizing for?" The attendant hesitated for a moment, as though choosing her words carefully. Finally, she let out a soft sigh. "You see, Mr. Williams, there was a mix-up in the system. We didn't realize who you were. We had no idea. You were the owner of this airline." James felt his eyebrows furrow in confusion. "What do you mean, the owner?" he asked. It took him a moment to fully comprehend the weight of her words. The realization hit him all at once. She was talking about the airline he owned, the one he had built from the ground up, the company he had worked tirelessly for, the one that had made him successful and respected in the industry. He leaned back, letting the shock of it sink in. You had no idea who I was?" he asked, still trying to wrap his mind around the situation. "Is that why I was treated this way?" The attendant's face flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, Mr. Williams," she admitted. "We didn't realize who you were. And, well, I'm afraid some of the crew may have made assumptions based on your appearance. I can't tell you how sorry we are for the way you were treated." James was silent for a moment, absorbing what she was saying. He'd experienced prejudice before, but this was different. It was one thing to be judged by strangers in society, but to be disrespected on his own airline. It was a bitter pill to swallow. He felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could this happen? How could people who worked for him treat him this way? But as he looked at the attendant, he saw genuine remorse in her eyes. She wasn't making excuses or trying to justify the behavior. She was simply acknowledging the mistake and offering her apology. "I appreciate your apology," James said finally, his voice steady, but with an edge of disappointment. "But this isn't just about an apology. It's about the fact that you and your colleagues treated me this way in the first place." The attendant nodded, her expression sincere. "We understand, and we will do everything we can to make this right, Mr. Williams. We have learned a very important lesson today." James nodded, his anger slowly fading as he processed everything. He wasn't the type of person to hold grudges, but he couldn't ignore what had just happened. He hoped this moment would serve as a wake-up call for the crew and for the passengers about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of treating everyone with respect. As the conversation came to an end, the flight attendant excused herself, leaving James alone with his thoughts. The moment had shifted, and the realization that the crew had made such a mistake still weighed heavily on him. However, he was determined to let it go, knowing that it wasn't just about this one incident, it was about the bigger picture. He would use this experience to ensure that his airline, and the people who worked for him, would never make such a mistake again. But the story wasn't over yet. James had no idea that, as the plane continued its journey, things were about to take another unexpected turn that would leave everyone aboard stunned. As James leaned back in his seat, he found himself reflecting on everything that had just happened. The tension from earlier was still hanging in the air, but now there was a quiet, uneasy calm. The apology from the flight attendant had been sincere, but it didn't take away the sting of the experience. He could still feel the weight of the dismissive stares, the coldness in their actions, and the nagging feeling that they hadn't treated him the same as the other passengers. He had earned his place in first class, just like anyone else, yet he had been made to feel like he didn't belong. He wondered how many others had faced the same thing. How many people had been judged not by their worth or actions, but by the way they looked. It made him angry, but more than that, it made him sad. How could people still think like that in this day and age? How could an entire crew, working on the very airline he owned, behave in such a way? The flight continued smoothly, but James's mind raced. He knew that he had to confront the issue when the flight landed, but for now, there was nothing he could do. The flight attendants had apologized, and the matter seemed to be over. But something told him that this wouldn't be the end of the story, not for him, and certainly not for the airline. A few hours later, as the plane began its descent, the head flight attendant approached James. She was the one who had first treated him with such indifference, but now her face showed something entirely different: guilt, shame, and a touch of embarrassment. She cleared her throat, her voice quieter than before. "Mr. Williams," she began, "I want to personally apologize again for the way you were treated. It was wrong, and I can assure you that this won't happen again. I've already spoken to the rest of the crew, and we are all aware of the mistake that was made. We truly regret that this happened on our flight." James looked at her, his expression calm but firm. "I appreciate your apology," he said slowly, "but apologies aren't enough. This goes beyond just one flight, and it's not just about me. It's about how we treat each other, no matter who we are." The flight attendant nodded, clearly taking his words to heart. "You're right. It's something we all need to work on. I understand that now. And I want you to know that this is a lesson we'll take with us going forward." James sighed, feeling the weight of the situation settle in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected from the apology, but it wasn't just about making the flight attendants feel better. It was about ensuring that the culture of his airline, and the people who worked for him, changed for the better. He didn't want to be a part of an airline that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. "I'll be making sure that our company values respect, fairness, and inclusivity," James said. "It's not just about getting the job done. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued. I hope you understand the importance of that." The flight attendant looked down, clearly understanding the weight of his words. "I do, Mr. Williams. I really do. And I'll make sure to do my part in making sure this doesn't happen again. You have my word." James gave her a small nod, but his mind was already shifting toward the future. He couldn't change what had happened on this flight, but he could make sure it didn't happen again. He had the power to make a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone who worked for him and for the people who flew with his airline. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to prepare for disembarkation, James couldn't help but feel a sense of determination. He had been humiliated, yes, but now he had the opportunity to turn this experience into something positive. He would use his position, his platform, to make sure that everyone, regardless of their background, was treated with the respect they deserved. But before he left the plane, he would make one final point to the flight attendants. He would ensure they understood the seriousness of the situation, not through anger, but through a commitment to change. It was time to move forward, but only if it meant making a real lasting impact. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the buzz of passengers preparing to disembark filled the cabin. The mood was a mixture of excitement and relief. For James, however, it was far from over. The apology from the flight attendants had been a step in the right direction, but he couldn't just let it go. Not without making sure something more meaningful came from the experience. He stood up slowly, gathering his things as the crew moved quickly down the aisles. Most passengers were already focused on leaving, chatting excitedly, or scanning their phones for the next part of their journey. But for James, this wasn't just another flight. It was a turning point, one that needed to be addressed. As the flight attendants worked to prepare for landing, James caught sight of the head flight attendant from earlier, the one who had initially treated him with such indifference. She was busy gathering supplies but saw him approach. Her face tightened, and for a brief moment, she looked nervous. James didn't want to make this uncomfortable, but he knew it was time for one more conversation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. She turned to face him, her expression apologetic. "Mr. Williams," she started, "I just want to apologize again for what happened. It shouldn't have gone down that way, and I regret it deeply." James nodded, acknowledging her words, but he knew this wasn't just about apologies anymore. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate that, but I want to make sure you understand the bigger picture here." The flight attendant's brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean, sir?" James took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "It's not just about one mistake. It's about what happened today, and what could have happened if I hadn't been the person I am. I own this airline, and I work hard to make sure everyone is treated fairly. But what I experienced wasn't just bad service. It was something deeper. It's about respect. It's about recognizing that people deserve to be treated equally, no matter where they come from or what they look like." The flight attendant nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I understand, Mr. Williams, and I want you to know that we've learned from this. It's something we will take seriously, not just as a lesson for this flight, but moving forward in our work." James looked at her carefully, making sure she saw the sincerity in his eyes. "I hope so. I hope this doesn't just end here with a few words of apology. I want you, and the rest of the crew, to know that this is an opportunity to change, not just in how we serve customers, but in how we treat each other. We set the tone for everyone else. I want to make sure that every employee here feels valued and respected, no matter their background." There was a long pause as the flight attendant absorbed his words. Then she nodded again. "You're absolutely right. I can see that now, and I'm truly sorry it took this long for me to understand. I'll make sure the crew gets the message." James could see that she was genuinely trying to take responsibility, and that made him feel a bit better. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was a step toward change. He had always believed in the power of education and understanding, and he hoped this experience would open the eyes of the entire crew, even if they didn't realize it at first. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm glad to hear that. I just want this airline, my airline, to be a place where everyone feels welcome and respected. It's a lesson we all need to carry with us, in our work and in our lives." The flight attendant smiled back, a look of determination in her eyes. "We will, Mr. Williams. Thank you for helping us see that." As James made his way off the plane, he felt a sense of accomplishment, though it was bittersweet. The journey wasn't over yet, not for him or for the crew. But he was hopeful. He knew that with time, the lessons learned today would stick with them. This incident might have started in disappointment, but it had ended with a chance for growth. And that, he thought, was the most important part of all. As James stepped off the plane and into the busy terminal, the hustle and bustle of travelers surrounded him. The usual sound of rolling suitcases and voices filled the air, but today it felt different. The weight of the experience still hung over him, lingering in the back of his mind. It was a reminder of the reality he had faced during the flight, a reality that many people of color still experienced, even in places where they should have felt safe and respected. He didn't let the frustration consume him, but he also knew that something had to change, and it was up to him to ensure it did. James made his way to the baggage claim area, his thoughts racing. He knew that this incident could be seen as just a small moment in his life, but it was bigger than that. It was about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of their background, felt equal and valued, and that started with him. He had the power to make a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone who worked for his airline and the passengers who trusted it with their journeys. As he waited for his luggage, he pulled out his phone and began to send a series of emails, one to his senior team and another to the head of human resources. He didn't want to let this moment pass by without action. He needed to address the issue head-on, to make sure his employees understood the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect. But more than that, he wanted to set an example for the industry as a whole. The email to his team was clear and to the point. He explained the situation on the flight, how he had been treated, and the lessons learned. He emphasized that the incident wasn't about pointing fingers, but about creating change. He asked them to meet with the crew, to address the underlying issues of bias, and to ensure that this kind of behavior was never repeated. As James finished writing, he couldn't help but feel a bit of pride. It wasn't easy confronting the issue, but he knew it was necessary. He wasn't someone who shied away from challenges. In fact, he had built his career by confronting them head-on. But this was different. This wasn't just a business decision. It was a personal one. He had experienced what so many others had faced, and it had left a mark on him. But it also gave him the drive to change things for the better. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a response from the head of HR. She had received the email and already set up a meeting for the following week. James smiled, relieved to know that action was already being taken. It wasn't just about making an impact in the moment. It was about ensuring lasting change. As he grabbed his suitcase from the conveyor belt, he looked around the terminal once more. The faces of the people around him were diverse, each one with its own story, its own journey. And in that moment, he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone. The passengers, the crew, and the people who worked for his airline. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long while, James felt hopeful. He had the opportunity to make a real difference, not just in his company, but in the lives of others. As he made his way toward the exit, he felt a sense of purpose settle in his chest. The path ahead was clear, and he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The lessons of this day would stay with him, not just in his business dealings, but in the way he approached every interaction, every moment. He was committed to ensuring that respect, understanding, and kindness were at the heart of everything he did. And that, he knew, would make all the difference. The next few days after the flight felt like a whirlwind for James. He was consumed with meetings, emails, and preparations for the upcoming business conference, but in the back of his mind, the incident on the plane lingered. It wasn't something he could easily forget, nor did he want to. It had sparked something in him, a drive to make sure that his airline was more than just a business. It needed to be a place where every person, regardless of who they were, felt valued and respected. James didn't waste any time. He followed through on his promise to himself and his team. He called for a company-wide meeting, gathering all the staff, flight attendants, pilots, management, and crew. It was a large group, but he knew this was an opportunity to change the culture of the airline for the better. He wanted to ensure that no one would ever be made to feel the way he had felt on that flight. The message had to be clear. There was zero tolerance for disrespect, bias, or prejudice. As the meeting began, James addressed the staff with a calm but firm tone. He spoke about his experience on the plane, about how he had been treated because of the assumptions others had made based on his appearance. He made it clear that this wasn't about a single flight, but about a deeper, systemic issue that needed to be tackled. He didn't hold back, explaining how personal this was for him, and how it affected not just him, but everyone involved. "I want all of you to think about the passengers who fly with us," James said, standing at the front of the room, his voice echoing through the space. "They trust us with their safety, their comfort, and their well-being. And it's our job to make sure they are treated with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are, where they come from, or how they look. Every single person is valuable." The room was silent as the weight of his words settled over the employees. James could see that the message was getting through, but he also knew it wasn't enough to just speak about the issue. Actions were what truly mattered. He outlined a series of initiatives to address unconscious bias, including more comprehensive diversity training for all staff and a new, clear set of guidelines for handling customer interactions. "Going forward," he continued, "we will be proactive in addressing issues of bias, both from our staff and our passengers. We're going to create an environment where every person, whether they're a customer or an employee, feels seen, heard, and respected." The response from the team was positive. Many of the staff were ashamed of the way things had played out, and they appreciated that James had taken the time to address the issue so directly. It wasn't just an apology, it was a plan for action. James was not one to let things slide. He made it clear that this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the company put its plan into motion. Diversity workshops were scheduled, and new policies were rolled out to help employees recognize and combat bias. James worked closely with HR to ensure that these changes were implemented effectively. He made sure that every team member understood that this wasn't just a one-time conversation, it was an ongoing commitment to change. And while the work wasn't easy, James began to see positive shifts. Employees became more aware of their interactions with passengers, and there was a noticeable change in the overall atmosphere of the airline. James wasn't naive. He knew that this would take time, but he was committed. The incident on the plane had given him the clarity he needed to steer his company in the right direction. Months later, when James walked through the airport again, he could feel the difference. There was a renewed energy in the air, one that was warm, welcoming, and open. The staff had embraced the new values, and passengers were noticing the change. James smiled as he watched a family of diverse passengers being helped with warmth and kindness by one of his crew members. It was a small moment, but it was a reflection of the larger change taking place. The incident that had started as a painful experience had turned into an opportunity for growth and transformation. James had taken the lesson to heart, and in doing so, had created a ripple effect of positive change in his company. More than that, he had reminded everyone, including himself, of the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. In the end, that was what mattered most, ensuring that every person, no matter their background, was treated with the fairness they deserved.